Good afternoon. My name is Amy Wood, and I am the Executive Director of the Raymond A. Wood Foundation. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Destiny Pacha, a passionate advocate, educator, and researcher working at the intersection of rare disease and education. Dr. Pacha is the president of Empower Ed Solutions, where she supports families, educators, and professionals in navigating the complex needs of children with rare and medically complex conditions. She partners closely with families to secure appropriate educational, behavioral, and health services while working with schools to improve awareness and build best practices. As a faculty member at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, Dr. Pacha contributes to Behavioral Innovations for Rare Diagnoses Lab with a research focus on inclusive evidence-based strategies for supporting students with Prader-Willi syndrome. Dr. Pacha is also the co-author of Prader-Willi Syndrome, a primer for school psychologists, and a frequent speaker at both national and international events. She recently presented at the International PWS Conference, leading sessions on school safety, IEP development, and supporting critical transitions. Through webinars and her parent training series, she continues to equip families with practical tools to advocate for their children's success. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Destiny Pacha. And Dr. Pacha, I'm just going to let everyone know that you're going to go ahead and present, but if people have questions, to please post them in our chat section or in the QA box. And when you get to the end of your presentation, we will address those questions. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today. I know you heard in that wonderful thank you introduction, Amy. I won't need to go over it myself. I do currently specialize in Prader-Willi syndrome, but as some of you may know, that PWS is also a hypothalamic dysfunction disorder. So it does relate very closely. And a lot of the characteristics and side effects can be very similar. So today we're going to go over Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, IDEA eligibility and IEPs, and then school support specific for your students. So when looking at the hypothalamic brain tumors, a lot of the skill deficits that come out of that, I have listed here. And these are things that we're going to talk about throughout the presentation today in areas that we can support any of these deficits through either 504 plan or an IEP. So the cognitive deficits with the attention and working memory, the slowed processing speed, and then executive functioning. So depending on the level of your child's deficits in these areas would determine whether they need a 504 plan or an IEP to meet their needs. So as we go through, it's kind of keeping it in mind where your child falls and what level of support and services that he or she may need in the school system. Emotionally and socially, there is anxiety that can lead to school avoidance, low self-esteem, and deficits in the social skills and maintaining friendships. Obviously, some of the physical limitations that come out of it is going to be fatigue, the GI system, stamina, balance, and this is where some of your OT, PT for fine and gross motor may come into play at school, and then possibly having some hearing loss and vision impairment. So we're going to start with Section 504. Sometimes I've been told that people call this like the baby IEP. It really isn't. It is its own plan and it has its own purpose. So it is a civil rights law that is in place in order to eliminate discrimination. So technically, Rehabilitation Act of 1973 isn't just for schools. So that is one of the biggest differences between Section 504 and IDEA. So this is a civil rights law. The purpose of it is to ensure access to the same education for us, what we're here for, and opportunities as their peers. This also would fall into line with jobs later on in life, but because today we're talking about in the school system. So a 504 plan will protect students from exclusion, denial of participation, and unfair discipline through an MDR. So an MDR is a manifestation determination review, and we'll touch on it a little bit more later, but it gives protections to students with disabilities that, they may participate in a behavior that would fall in line with, a disciplinary action and determining whether their behavior was a manifestation of their disability. So it allows for additional protections in determining that. So we're going to go through the process under Section 504. You'll notice that when we get to IDEA, it is very similar. There are just a few differences in the evaluation process and then obviously the qualifications. So the first thing under Section 504 is you need to define the disability. So this can get a little complicated because the definition under the law, it says it's a physical or mental impairment or with having a record of the impairment. So that might be obviously a doctor's note, any of the evaluations, the referrals, all of the information that you guys probably have on hand to show the disability that your child has. But then also there is a little caveat of or regarded as having an impairment. So it is important to know that although in general, a medical diagnosis is not required to be found eligible under Section 504, but typically that is your first step is if you give the school a heads up or you tell them, that your child has had a brain tumor or has had to have surgery due to that, and then the dysfunction or any impairment that that may have caused for your child in school, then you guys would come together for a meeting. When the team gets together, it is possible that at that meeting, they're going to request consent to evaluate. But really, the evaluations under Section 504 are not as formal and that are required under IDEA. So it really, they must consider a range of data. So I kind of listed some on here because a 504 plan, to be eligible, you might have those medical documents, you might have teacher input, there might be frequency charts. Sometimes schools will say, we recognize that your child might have a disability. However, we're going to track how often they might need extended time, or we're going to need to track how often they're requesting to leave the room, or how often they're requiring to see the nurse. And so that's your data collection that they might ask to do and maybe come back to the table to review. They can also take into account academic scores. Obviously, your input is also very important. So the law states that the qualifications, so first you have an identified disability, and then that disability must substantially limit a major life activity. So it is not defined specifically what substantially limits is. So this is where sometimes schools can have some disagreement. Parents may see it as a significant restriction. The school might say it may not be substantial. But ultimately, you're trying to show that there is a restriction that is substantial or significant compared to most of their peers, but it doesn't have to prevent it entirely. So then the next question is, what's a major life activity? So this is from the ADA Amendment Act. There were pre-ADAA, which is kind of the life activities that were considered originally. So this would have been prior to 2008. They are still in effect, but they did expand in 2008. So originally things breathing, eating, walking, hearing, and performing manual tasks. Those were often very much based on the workforce, right? So working and caring for oneself. In 2008, when they expanded it to include more educational areas, so reading, concentrating, thinking, and communicating. So technically, your child very likely could have, substantial limitation in all of those or in one of those. It does not need to be more than one. It just has to be a major life activity. They also, when they expanded it, added major bodily function. So obviously, looking at these, your children very likely have quite a few of these, body systems that are not working completely or are, having some difficulty for their digestive system. We already talked about the GI, their brain functions, and then the bowel and bladder functions. So any of these areas, if your child has a substantial limitation in any of these, that would qualify them under Section 504. So when the team comes together, and again, this could be all at one meeting where you have requested a 504 or the nurse has noted that they know that your child has or has had a brain tumor or they have a hypothalamic dysfunction, they may come to the table and be able to present all of this at once and determine eligibility. Sometimes they're going to have to ask to get additional documentation. So this can be elongated over a little bit longer of time, but it can also be all in one. So it just depends on your school district. But what's really important to know is that mitigating measures cannot be considered when determining eligibility. So mitigating measures include things like medication. eyeglasses. So let's just say we're considering, attention and attention deficits that come along. That when, if a child is taking a medication for it, we have to determine eligibility as if they weren't taking the medication. Also, episodic conditions do qualify, even if they are in remission. So you've come to the table, you've reviewed the data. Obviously, your child has a medical diagnosis, and the team has determined that your child is eligible under Section 504. They would end up with a 504 plan. There's a couple different ones depending on your state. They may just have a 504 plan. Others may have temporary plans. I see these more when a child might break their arm and they're about to take a statewide test. They're going to need some sort of accommodations, but it's not going to last more than 6 months. There's also technically eligible where a child is determined to be eligible. They have a disability. It does substantially limit, but maybe because of mitigating measures, they don't need accommodations right now, or they don't need related services right now. But that does not mean that they may not qualify and require one later on, but they determine they meet all of the eligibility requirements under Section 504. So if you get a 504 plan, what do you get out of it? 504, just like IDEA, requires schools to provide a free and appropriate public education. So under Section 504, that can look like accommodations in their general education classroom. So that could be extended time, preferential seating. For the social emotional, it could be having a safe space in the room. It might be things like reducing workload because, obviously maintaining attention, they easily fatigue. Maybe it's reducing homework. Those are all areas that can be added under an accommodation plan under Section 504. What sometimes families don't realize is that the law actually does extend beyond accommodations. A lot of times I read, I hear from families, a 504 plan is accommodations and an IEP is services. In the broadest sense, that is true, but there are other supports that are allowed under Section 504. So supplementary aids and plans are considered under Section 504 if it allows the child to participate equally with their peers. So that might be having assistive technology. That might be having additional plans like a healthcare plan. Obviously, if they're needing to take any sort of medications at school or they're needing to be monitored for their temperature regulation. Also behavior plans. So we will talk a lot more about those even with IEPs, but if there is a behavior support plan that can be added onto a 504, and that may be having to have check-ins with an adult in the morning, maybe their anxiety is high and they need to have a safe person. The areas that are also considered, now this is where it can get a little confusing, is related services. So this is not special education, this is related services. These are services that a child requires to access their education, right? So transportation. Obviously, there might be special areas that are needed for transportation depending on where you live. Where I live, we would want to have an AC on the bus. Not many buses don't anymore, but in some areas they don't. In some states they don't. So if a AC or heater is required to help them with their temperature regulation, then that could be something that's also put on to the 504 plan. Speech, language, OT, and PT. This one gets a little tricky because a lot of districts don't realize that can fall under Section 504, but what they can do is they can bring in the therapist. They can have them do, observations. They can do screeners. They can even do a full evaluation and provide either direct or indirect services. So that might look like, following surgery, re-entering school, fine and gross motor, even adaptive PE if needed. And then obviously nursing supports and services. So if, the nursing care that might be needed, or if an aid is needed to support in other areas, especially if your child is experiencing hyperphagia, there might be additional supports that are needed for that. So the one thing about that idea of 504s being baby IEPs, they are legally binding documents and they are enforced by the Department of Ed of the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights. So that is different than obviously if you're falling under IDEA, but it is still legally binding and it is still enforced. Two additional areas. One is they are supported against bullying. So if your child is being bullied, that's where the OCR can come in because the child has a disability. The school does need to take extra precautions in assisting and adjusting, as needed for that. And then as we talked earlier about the unfair discipline. So again, this would be if your child, starts to become dysregulated and elopes from the room. That elopement might end up typically for one of their peers, they might end up getting, a behavior referral or an office referral, and there might be some sort of disciplinary action. Maybe that is needing to spend time in some sort of like in-school suspension or getting detention or Saturday school. But if that behavior, which for the child was eloping, the team would come together and determine, did they elope due to their disability? And so it adds an extra layer of protection. It requires the team to come together and again, gather information and use information from you, obviously your doctors, to determine, is eloping a manifestation? Depending on the situation in your child, it very likely would be. And therefore, if it is a manifestation, they could not be disciplined in the same way as their peers. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So this is where we're going to switching over, and we're now going to be talking about IDEA. So this is a federal special education law that ensures that students with disabilities are provided a free and appropriate public education, just like Section 504, and in their least restrictive environment, or their LRE. The purpose of it is to guarantee specially designed instruction, related services and supports to access the general curriculum and make meaningful educational progress. So there's two things in there that are different than Section 504. Specially designed instruction is only provided under an IEP under IDEA, and that they are going to have goals and making meaningful progress. So a 504 plan does not have goals. Therefore, an IEP, if goals are needed and specific instruction is needing to meet those goals and to make progress, that would fall under an IEP. This also ensures students with disabilities receive the same educational opportunities as their peers, and they also have similar protections when it comes to manifestations. So there are several parts under IDEA, but I always want to tell parents, because we're going to talk briefly about Part C, but mainly about Part B. So Part C is early intervention, but it's actually Part C, and then you go to Part B. So that's kind of one of those, you would think it would go B to C, but it's because the B was put in place first, and then early interventions were added on. And so the early interventions, if a child is found eligible under Part C, they do not receive an IEP. They receive an IFSP, an Individualized Family Support Plan. I feel like when it comes to either special education or students with disabilities in schools, it's like an alphabet soup of acronyms. So to qualify under Part C, again, this is for a child birth to 2 up until their 3rd birthday, must be experiencing delay in one or more of the following areas. So that is going to be mainly their development, so their cognitive, physical, communication. So again, depending on when your child may have had the brain tumor, or depending on when the child required to have that removed, that would depend on your child's age and whether Part C would even be appropriate or not. So I do want to say that I don't go too much into this, but it is a little bit of a different evaluation process. This is typically through early steps, and the family support plan is providing services in the child's either community or home, or maybe the daycare that they're at. But once we get to Part B starts at age 3 until the child's 22nd birthday, or that year that they would be turning 22. So there are several ways to start this process. So we kind of talked about with under Section 504, you had to have, a disability that was, defined, whether that is something that, the school has observed and is able to, define that they have it, or that you have the medical documentation. So eligibility under Part B can kind of start in a couple different ways. Obviously, if your child was eligible for Part C, it's going to go ahead and flow right into the evaluations for Part B. So as a child is getting close to their 3rd birthday, the team would come together and determine if evaluations are needed or what evaluations are needed, and then we would start at the evaluations. There's also child find. So if you show up at school, and you are telling the nurse all about, your child's diagnosis, their procedures, and the side effects, and, the characteristics that are now coming out from that, the nurse then is responsible to go and let somebody know that through child find, they have identified a child on campus that has a disability and may qualify under Section 504 or IDEA. And then obviously there's always a parent request for either plan. Whether you did go to the nurse or you go straight to the special education coordinator or the principal and just state, I feel my child is eligible as a student with a disability and I would like to request evaluations. So we're going to go through this process starting with the evaluations. And again, this is going to show a little bit different than under 504. So your initial evaluations for Part B can start, like I said, before a child's third birthday if they're already under Part C. But they're going to conduct new evaluations specific to a suspected disability, and that there is a very specific list of those disabilities that we'll talk about. It is important to note that just because a child might have received support and interventions under Part C, it doesn't automatically qualify them for Part B because the requirements for eligibility are a little different. Remember, the other one was only about having kind of developmental delays in one or more of those areas. This gets very specific in each category has very specific criteria to meet eligibility. So the law states that schools must use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant functional, developmental, and academic information. So a lot of times families will say, well, I've been told by the school it's not, academically relevant. Well, that's not what we're only looking at now. We need to be looking at their function, their development, and their academics. So that does include their social emotional, that does include their independent functioning or executive functioning skills. So this is by no means an all, extensive list, but these are some of the areas that a school may, determine with you as part of the team to go ahead and assess. So their cognitive level, their language and speech, fine motor, gross motor, obviously hearing and vision. We also know that, as we already talked about, some of those social emotional deficits, the assistive technology, there might be interviews and observations, and then there's also possibly need for academic skills, but not always necessarily for your child. So this team is sitting here at a meeting, you're trying to determine what, eligibility criteria your child might fit under. And so based on evaluations, the team then determines if the child meets eligibility for one of the 13 categories under IDEA. So first, the child has to meet eligibility for one or more of those disability categories. It has to have an adverse impact on the child's education. But again, education doesn't just mean academics. Education includes their socializing, that includes their communication. So it's impacting their education. And then need for specially designed instruction. So that is the biggest difference between IDEA and Section 504. So this is stating that not only does the child have a disability, they meet eligibility under one of these categories, but they require specially designed instruction. So if after all of this, the team determines that the child is eligible and requires these services, then they would develop an individualized education program or plan, which we all just know as an IEP. So what are those 13 categories? And where might your child be determined eligible? This is the list. States do have some flexibility in how they assess and how they implement these categories. So for example, the speech and language impairment that is under IDEA, in some states, they separate that. And they separate speech being articulation and language being expressive, receptive, and pragmatic. And some states keep it together. So that's just one example. So typically for children that have had a hypothalamic or pituitary brain tumor, most of the time I would see eligibility. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but it's under the OHI, so other health impaired. That is simply indicating that there is a medical diagnosis that the child that is impacting the child's education to the extent needing the specially designed instruction and supports and services under IDEA. Depending on your child's severity of needs, it is possible that a child may be determined eligible under a traumatic brain injury or a TBI. And then also, depending on where the tumor was located and its removal, there may have been visual impairments that come along. So really, it just depends on where your child is. Typically, I go under other health impaired as a primary because that is a pretty big umbrella that can kind of encapsulate all of the diagnoses that might come along. So there is an alternative eligibility program that does start at age 3. There's a note at the bottom that California, Iowa, and Texas and Puerto Rico do not recognize this category, and every state does have a little bit of a difference in their time frame. So if at age 4, ask that the school district evaluate your child due to the medical diagnosis and now having some difficulties in different developmental areas, there may be an eligibility for this kind of additional program. It's kind of like the 13 plus. So this is where the IDA federal law notes that it can be ages 3 through 9 experiencing developmental delays. So, however, this tends to be more for, again, it can change its time frame because some states only go to 5, some will go to age 7, but it can go through age 9. So it's having delays through diagnostic instruments of physical development, cognitive development, communication development, social, emotional, and adaptive, and therefore needs special education. So although typically school starts in kindergarten or age 5, there is this ability to have these services between age 3 and 5 under this program, with the idea that by providing interventions early, they might be able to close that gap for later on. So we've done an evaluation, we've determined eligibility. Now we know that they need specialized instruction or special education, so we're going to develop the IEP. So what is on an IEP? If you do not have one, or if you are, trying to review your own child's IEP, these are kind of the main sections of the IEP that are outlined. I'm not going to necessarily go into all of these today just for time, but I am going to touch on the ones that I think are very specific to your children. So an IEP does have to have present levels of academic and functional performance. So previously, before the reauthorization, which now it's hard to believe, back in 2004, that was called the PLEP because it was just educational performance. But again, now we understand that it is academic and functional performance. The special considerations in health, we will talk more about that. Goals and objectives. So the goals on an IEP should be based on that present level statement. So in the present level, we want to have the child's strengths. We want to have the child's, difficulties, weaknesses, struggles, and the effect of that disability that they have on maintaining that progress. So the goal should be geared towards finding those areas of weakness and providing services and making measurable goals to meet those within the year of the IEP. I could go a whole presentation on just goals and objectives, but that's not for today's purpose. Then we do have the accommodations, modifications, and supplementary aids and services. You'll notice a lot of those are what can also be on a Section 504. So again, the two big differences, I have the big arrows there, is having goals and objectives, and then having the specially designed instruction and related services. So related services can be under Section 504, but specially designed instruction cannot be. That is only under IDEA. And then an IEP also includes a section for support and training for school personnel. For this population, that's really important. That's a time that you can have the IEP note that maybe the school needs to have training on specific healthcare plans. Maybe the school needs to have training on the effects of, the hypothalamus and what that does for your child's emotional regulation, for their body function and regulation. Anything that the school needs, or maybe it's providing them with information or handouts or resources for the staff to read every year. So that section really is a great section. It also can allow for somebody to provide, consulting, or if they need to work with or meet with maybe additional providers outside of the school. That section is one that you'll definitely want to keep an eye for and add to it as needed for your child. So this is talking about the special consideration. So under IDEA, the team is required to ask these guiding questions about the child in every IEP meeting. So asking, does the child have communication needs? So that can be speech, like we talked about, articulation, that can be language. Do they already have speech or language therapy? Then that should be marked yes, they do have communication needs. Do they utilize some sort of alternative communication? If so, then yes, they have communication needs. there is a separate question just for assistive technology. So that does not necessarily mean an AAC or an alternative communication device. That could be things like using a slant board or having alternative seating even, because of, how where your child might sit, maybe their stature might need a different desk or a different chair. Those are technically assistive technology pieces, but also can fall under supplementary aids. Some of these areas, I say it's not worth dying on a sword for where it goes as long as it gets on your child's IEP. Does your child have vision and hearing impairments? If so, then that section should be marked yes, and then the team has to determine how they're going to support your child. Other ones are whether the child is limited English, so is English their native language or their primary language in the home, whether they require extended school year. That's also very different from a 504 plan, because if a student requires specially designed instruction, they may require an extension to their year, meaning that whether it's over summer or a long break, they might continue to need services. And then the question is often asked about behavior. Does behavior impede your child's learning or the learning of other? This question here, I always want to caution parents. I think in our minds, typically as a parent, we think, does behavior impede? We're wondering, are they throwing things or are they hitting people? But that doesn't necessarily have to be the behavior that we're targeting. There can be other areas that for behavior could be, like I mentioned, eloping or trying to escape work, or needing to leave for emotional regulation or for, additional supports from additional staff. Those can be also behaviors that are impeding. If your child has to leave the room multiple times a day, they're missing out on instruction. So that is a behavior that's impeding learning. So the health needs section, obviously there's a lot that needs to be on there. So any medical information that you have that, the school will put in there, obviously anything specific to hypothalamic obesity or the brain tumor, or it's, afterwards the care for it. If there's needs at school by the nurse, hygiene needs. If your child does have hyperphagia, food security at school, if there's a diabetes action plan, and then if they're requiring any hydrocortisone at school, these are all things that can be put into that health section. But more detail would be on an additional plan, and we'll talk about those. So accommodations, again, this is an area that would be on section 504 as well. So if your child is only needing accommodations, then they may not qualify for an IEP right now. And that may change though. It doesn't have to be this is a one time for all. So in general, accommodations are in how you present information or, the instruction, how your child responds, so how they answer it, the setting, so location, size of the class, if they need special lighting, special seating. Scheduling would be time of day with that height, fatigue that comes in. They might have an accommodation that for any sort of standardized testing, or any high stakes testing, it's done in the morning and not in the afternoon, and that can be an accommodation that's on there. And then the assessments would be, there's often now a completely different section just for district and statewide assessments. They should mirror classroom assessments or accommodations, but there are some that are not allowed on any state testing. So that's where there may be some that are on for classroom but not on for assessment. So some examples that would be very likely needed for your children would be things like wait time for processing, frequent rest breaks, executive functioning. So that's your organizers, your, utilizing charts and checklists, having repetition of key information, staggering transition. So if there's a balance or mobility difficulty, then you might want to have your child not leave when the hallways are packed and they could get bumped or knocked over. And then alternative response. Again, if our fine motor is delayed or has now, the difficulty with writing, we might need to have either a keyboard or, depending on their age, the option to provide verbal responses to some questions. And that may also change based on the time. During the morning, maybe writing is not as difficult, but by afternoon, due to the fatigue and the fine motor deficits, they are unable to really write an extensive amount. So maybe in the afternoon, they require different accommodation. Some other ones that I typically look for would be reduced workload and homework, emphasizing that quality over quantity. So again, I'm not asking that this school say, oh, you don't have to do, this entire unit, But if they're going to give, hopefully nobody's doing it, but 50 math problems and every 10 is a different skill, maybe they just have to do 3 in each section versus all 50. Obviously, extra time to complete work and sometimes eliminating time requirements altogether. I'm not saying that they never have to turn in assignments, but there are some assessments that are more diagnostic that they have a timer set for and the child can see the timer. That's going to cause that heightened anxiety that we don't need. So, having that option removed by having that extra time, extended time, or eliminating that part of the assessment so that you can actually assess your child's true abilities without having that heightened anxiety. And then obviously another big one is allowing frequent restroom breaks and access to their water, especially depending on if they have also been diagnosed with the diabetes. So supplementary aids and services. So this is not specially designed instruction. These are actually supplemental supports or services or aids. These can be things such as the assistive technology or the timer or the visual schedules like we talked about, where if you checked yes to that first question, this would be where they might be listed. This is also where your supplemental plans would be listed. Again, that would be maybe your behavior plan and your healthcare plan, and we'll talk about that in just a second. This could also be if your child needs additional personnel, supports throughout the day, maybe during certain parts of the day, maybe all day, maybe just during, access to food times or in the hallway. So some examples again are, your visual schedules and supports, sensory tools and giving those breaks if they start becoming dysregulated, collaborating with the school nurse if depending on your child's needs, maybe you require daily communication log back and forth. And then obviously the behavior plans. And then again, depending on your child's needs, possibly having supervision during meal times to limit accessing food that is not within their diet. And then if they need adult supervision for transitions, whether this is to prevent eloping, to protect them from, possible falls and bumps, that could be also written in during this time. So those supplemental plans that we've talked about, so your behavior intervention plan, again, doesn't have to be things like hitting and throwing objects are self-injury. It could just be that they are escaping a lot of work or that they're having heightened, dysregulation and they need additional supports. So our goal is to reduce those targeted behaviors by teaching alternatives, positive strategies, and providing interventions. That's all outlined on that behavior plan. So if your child has a behavior plan, I have the little arrow there. You want that plan to just be noted on the IEP because some states have it as right part of the IEP and some it's a standalone document that then is attached. The other one is an individualized health plan. So obviously this would be for any of the healthcare needs that would fall under, your child's care. So, monitoring for their body temperature, if there's any, needing to have toileting schedules or if there's, medication needs. There's a whole bunch of different plans that can fall under this. And if there's support strategies or interventions that the team needs to be aware of. So the specially designed instruction. So your special education services, again, this is what separates an IEP from a 504 plan. So these are just some examples, ones that I commonly see. So especially for this population, that those executive functioning skills are, they are definitely delayed and show areas of struggle. So instruction in that, sometimes it might be listed as independent functioning, but that can do all kinds of things of organization, planning, of projects, all of that can fall under that. Then you have social skills instruction. Speech and language therapy, I have a double asterisk there because speech and language, depending on your state, it can be a program and a service, we listed as one of the 13 categories. And then some places and some students only need it as a related service, meaning they didn't necessarily meet the eligibility criteria under IDEA, but they still need it to access their education. That can get really tricky and something that is a topic for another day. Adaptive PE, especially depending on your child's motor skills, possibly after surgery, they might require an alternative or an adapted physical ed. If your child is bound to the home or the hospital for a period of time, they can receive instruction in those areas. Typically now it is virtual, but again, that would be based on your child's needs and the district that you reside in. As they get older, sometimes there's community-based instruction, so actually going out into the community, practicing skills, and then the instruction and academic skills. So this one is a little bit more difficult for this population because, the research shows that they tend to score average or above average on standardized measures of academic skills. However, all of the difficulties that come into educational performance and making progress can change over time. So I did cite two articles here that I found to be very helpful in understanding how it can affect cognitive performance. And this also really would help, your school, your school psychologist understand that they might be able to, pass and score average on a basic skills test that they might be giving. But really, by the time we add everything else in that is high demands on your child, that can change over time. And maybe they're missing more school, or maybe when their, processing speed is all taken into account, they're struggling in school, even though they might be able to, again, score well on some sort of standardized test. So that can be difficult to understand for schools and school districts. But I think these two articles, and again, I can, when I send all this out afterwards, if you have any questions, please let me know. All right, so the related services, again, these are available under Section 504 and also under IDEA. So this is where, your child requires some unique services to support them. Typically for an IEP, it's to access their special education. So these would be your occupational therapy, your physical therapy, again, speech and language, depending, your transportation, your health services, your audiology, if interpreting services are needed. And then another big one is counseling services, especially with some of the social emotional deficits that come into place. And then their, difficulty with maybe maintaining friendships, that counseling can really help. It also with that anxiety, any sort of obsessive compulsive behaviors that might come into play. I always like to note that if your child, depending on their age and on their level of need, if they do require support with toileting, or if they do require a diaper, or are still in a pull-up, beyond the early years, that this can be built in. Whether it's, just having a bathroom schedule, whether it's assisting them, because if they're finding gross motor is difficult, sometimes, cleaning up after themselves can be difficult. So this is also an area that if that is needed, it would be listed. Sometimes it is as a personal care support. Sometimes it's a personal care aid. It just depends on the level that your child needs. I am so excited that I was able to do that. I wanted to make sure to leave time for questions. I know it is a lot of information, and I was telling Amy I could probably pick a couple slides and talk a whole hour on it. But this is my information, my website. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, and I do post frequently. I posted today about the commonalities between hypothalamic obesity and PWS to help people understand how they can overlap. So please, I am here if there are questions, and you can also reach out at any time. I'm going to stop sharing, Amy, so you can. All right.
Thank you, Destiny. We do have one question so far, and I just remind everyone, if you have questions, now's the time. And you can post them in the chat or in the QA feature box. But Jason has a question. He says, if we have frequent restroom breaks due to DI, diabetes insipidus, should we also ask for extended test time in case restroom breaks are needed during a test? We are just starting this process and it's all new.
Absolutely. So not only would an accommodation, depending again on where, the level of need, if they need the specialized instruction or just the accommodations, frequent restroom breaks, obviously we don't want to be stopping that. Access to their water. But then because of both of those, yes, extended time would be needed, but also just remembering that with the executive functioning and the processing speed, extended time is one that would probably be needed regardless even of the restroom breaks. But definitely that's a great question. And, please keep sending the questions, because if you're just starting, I know it can be so overwhelming.
Thank you. Kevin asks, if your child seems to be getting their needs met via 504, but also seem to qualify for an IEP, is it worth pushing for the IEP?
Oh, that is so student specific. If your child is doing well and is able to, function and access their education with a 504 plan, then that would be, to me, the least restrictive, right? Because once you get into an IEP, you're starting to look at specially designed instruction, which may require them to be pulled out of the classroom. And again, if they're able to, I use the word function because that's just kind of the global word of it, but they're able to be in school just with those accommodations, then I don't know if I would push for it. But again, I don't know your child. But remembering that specially designed instruction may require them to be removed from their general classroom, whereas the 504, those accommodations are done within the classroom.
Thank you. Rachel asks, not sure if it is related to IEPs or if it can be included in IEPs, but when I think of going to school, I was wondering about the AI, that's adrenal insufficiency emergency injection, and how that works to have somebody on hand available to give that shot at all times. So I think a lot of times there's different schools that maybe don't have nurses on site to give the injection should there be an emergency, and what should people do about that?
I actually ran into something similar to this just the other day. So, the first thing is to communicate with the school nurse or health aide, or maybe at your district level. So there's typically a district nurse or a health department, within the district to ask, because every district does have differences. Sometimes if you're an RN and you are a school nurse, you're able to do more, not only because you are an RN, but the district recognizes that, whereas others would not allow what an RN can do maybe at a doctor's office to do as long as they're an employee of the district. So that does get difficult. So making sure that you have that plan in place. So whether it's an individual health plan or an emergency action plan, or just, even a medication plan, because that would be an emergency medication. It would be similar to having possibly, access to an EpiPen or to seizure medications, injections that would be needed for that. So again, I would communicate with them, but yes, that should be in a plan. If your child has a 504, that could be a separate health plan. That could be, access to it and then noting that there is a health plan. Because obviously, if there is a substitute, we want that plan to be provided so that in case that emergency happens with somebody who, is coming in to take over for the class for the day, we want that to be documented somewhere and make sure that the nurse or the aide knows what to do. And sometimes that might be to call 911. If it is outside of their scope. And that's when then the family has to decide, is that the school that they should be at? Do they require a nurse at school? And then those are even longer and bigger discussions to have on if, an RN is required or if maybe a health aide is required with your child throughout the day.
Thank you. Um, any other burning questions? I think we have a little question lull. What is your advice to people that are seeming to, they have an IEP in place, they have these goals and objectives, but things just don't seem to be getting done? What is the process? What should people do if they're just not seeing things being done according to the IEP?
Sadly, I get asked that a lot. Really, it is asking for the data. So within the IEP, every goal that's on there is going to be required to have how they're going to assess it and how frequently they're going to report that to parents. Typically, that is concurrent with the report card. So where I live, we do report cards every quarter. Some do it by trimesters, and they go along with that. However, that does not mean that's the has to be end all be all. It's individualized. So let's say you're really worried about some of the social emotional skills. You could have those goals being reported to you more frequently, but also just asking for a meeting or asking to see the data. The data should be being collected, whether they're reporting it to you quarterly or, bi-monthly or weekly. I have had some families that, we just put it in a plan where we'll get the data every Friday on specific needs as it relates to social emotional needs. And then, when we review that, if the team decides we need to at least even do a mini meeting to kind of see if we can, head off some of these, that way, it's being followed, what's happening in the classroom, but also you can ask for service logs. So when it comes to specific services, so whether it's your OT, PT, or even your, specially designed instruction in math, there are logs that they have to keep, they have to show that they're providing these services. So some schools will use, their online program for scheduling. And because built into that has, when they're supposed to be getting their therapies or who they're seeing. Obviously, if it's specially designed instruction, it needs to be a certified teacher in special education. So you can kind of line that up. Also, when it is a related service and one that the district could bill Medicaid for, they have their own log. So a lot more in depth from your OT, your PT, and your speech and language pathologist. But a lot of times the question tends to be with accommodations, right? How can you make sure those are happening? Again, you can actually ask for a log. So some teachers, back in the day when I was a teacher many moons ago, I had a stamp made. Now I see them online and on Etsy, and I love it, where like I could stamp a child's paper and say these are the accommodations that they used and they needed. And I would keep, track of that so that when the parent might say, hey, how often are they really needing that extended time? We can look back and find out. Maybe, a lot of times parents will ask for that extended time. I'm not talking about this population, but maybe the child really isn't using it. So that would be the time that you can ask for that data. But anything that is on either one of those plans should be being documented. So if you are worried about it, ask. Most of the time, they may not have everything you want, but it is also going to now put them on notice that you are going to be asking for it. And that way, it kind of will make sure that they're documenting that as they should be.
Thank you. Um, with your unique experience of working with people, families with kids with Prader-Willi syndrome, can you explain or share some of the things that are put in place as around food, especially for those with hyperphagia, um, especially in settings where there can be abundance of food in the cafeterias, so forth, vending machines, things like that. So, what are some of the things that are done to help um, protect the child in those circumstances?
First and foremost, educating the staff. They do not get it. I mean, if you're a parent of a child with hyperphagia and you try to explain that to somebody, the first thing you hear is, oh, I must have that. I'm always hungry. Obviously, that can be a little demeaning, and it's obviously not the way it is. So trying to make sure staff understands what it truly is. That is part of trainings that I provide, other organizations can provide, and trying to get them to understand so they have that empathy. But then, yes, you can put accommodations in for sure. The child only eats food provided from home. If they are going to go into the cafeteria, that there is somebody with them. Sometimes the child needs the one-on-one. Sometimes the child needs somebody, within, visual, just to kind of keep an eye out. And some kids need somebody within arm's reach. And again, that should be individualized. If the child is actively seeking and stealing, then we're going to need someone a lot closer than across, down at the end of the table, just keeping an eye. We also, often put into place that if there's going to be a food activity, that parents are given enough notice to either for me, I prefer to try to help the teacher realize they don't need food to do an activity. But if at the end of the day we are sitting in a situation, and some parents don't even want to do that, though. Some parents are like, if this is what everyone's doing, how can I help my child be participant in it? So if they're doing, counting Skittles, we might need to change that to pom-poms. Again, I'd love the whole class to change to pom-poms. And we get there. I mean, once I find school staff, again, teachers and educators didn't go into this for the money, right? So once they truly understand the difficulties that your child is having, especially the food anxiety and need for food security, I've had teachers go, I looked my whole year ahead. I used to have 5 different food activities. I've changed them and we're doing something else. Obviously, I highly praise those teachers. So anytime that happens, but there are ways of, if it's not going on the IEP and it goes into a health plan, again, if you don't have an IEP, but you have a 504 plan, those accommodations can go on there. And that's also where you can have the training. So that education for staff can also be on the IEP for them to have that training or at least be provided the information. Food security is definitely one of the most difficult that I find, and it's one that parents really struggle to explain on their own. Every parent is an expert on their child, and they are an expert in the disability and the diagnosis. By the time their child has it, they become that expert for their child. But schools still often see them as mom and dad, right? And that can be very difficult. So sometimes it is having that doctor's note or having somebody who's a professional in the field try to help them understand. It's sad. I wish schools would more often be like, yes, this parent obviously knows their child and we need to have food security precautions in. But if that isn't working, then that would be when your doctor could also provide some support. There is a plethora of accommodations. Obviously, it really needs to be individualized that I have assisted get to have put on IEPs and 504 plans. But again, depending on where your child's hyperphagic level is, maybe early on, they're not struggling as much with the seeking and stealing. Some obviously will even go into, consuming non-edible items. So then that brings in a whole nother level of safety and security. We also, for any sort of transition, sometimes more support is needed because depending on what grade, kids might be in the hallway eating a bag of Doritos and they throw it in the trash and half of it's still there and a child might, grab it and want to consume it. So then having somebody during those transitional times. But really it's trying to get food to be locked up. Often I ask, depending again on the age, if, lunch boxes are all out, maybe we just put them in a tub and put them outside. If food is consumed in the classroom, I often ask either that the trash be put in the hallway or that it be cleared out. So, some schools have set up with the custodian that after lunch, if that class eats in the classroom, the custodian comes by and takes that lunch out. Because obviously, even the smells and knowing it's there, that perseveration on trying to obtain that food is going to prevent learning. And that's really what parents need to focus on is how not only all of the risks that go along with hyperphagia and possible gorging, but just the fact that, the having it around is going to create such a level of anxiety and they will perseverate on that and no learning is taking place then. And that's how, if the question comes up, how is that affecting? It's affecting their concentration, which is one of the, major life activities. But it's also just as, as significant under an IEP, it's going to prevent them from being able to make progress. I could talk on that
I know,
topic
I can
forever. I
tell
know.
you have that experience. There's a lot of commonalities between Prader-Willi syndrome and those survivors of hypothalamic-pituitary tumors or craniopharyngioma that have hypothalamic involvement. So there's a lot of commonalities, and I find that our Prader-Willi syndrome counterparts have done a really excellent job of putting content out for educators. So a lot of times in my son's case, I direct them to that content because it's a lot of it's applicable, but it's really nice to kind of have your perspective and kind of dealing with it firsthand on behalf of families that are facing this. So thank you. I think we're coming to time. I wanted to just thank everyone who has joined us today and also Dr. Pasha for sharing her knowledge. And I know that Destiny is happy to answer any questions offline outside of this webinar. So we'll provide a link to a form if you want to submit a question. And you can also find Destiny at her website at empoweredsolutions.org or on Instagram at _empowered_solutions. And of course, if you're looking for any other educational content around these tumors, the ongoing effects and management of care, you can visit the Raymond A. Wood Foundation's YouTube channel. We have lots of videos and things to share. And then of course, and let's see, my Zoom likes to trick me a little bit. So I've lost my stop share. There it is. It always does that. And of course, we have to remind everybody that oh, no, the right one shared. Okay, sorry. We have to remind everybody that the Pituitary Brain Tumor Family Conference is coming up November 15th and 16th in Philadelphia, where we'll be talking about all kinds of things related to the endocrine issues, DI, adrenal insufficiency, research, hypothalamic obesity, all of the hot topics. So if you are interested, please visit our website to register. Registration is open for a few more weeks. And I think that's all. Destiny, thank you so much for joining us today. You are a wealth of knowledge. I'm sure we can do some follow-ups on some specific topics if anyone's interested. And I think as well, you're available for one-on-ones if people need a little bit more help in navigating this or working with their teams. So thank you.
Anytime. I'm so happy to be here. And I do plan on taking some of my resources and adjusting them, or at least, making it, understood for this population. So if there is anything a family sees online that they would like or to have me adjust, please shoot me an email. I'll put that at the top of the list for doing so.
Awesome. And we will share Destiny's email when we send out the recording and recap. And everyone, thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.